I'm now going to show you some cool stuff you can do with MoGraph's Displace Deformer. It allows you to successfully displace your clones a little bit easier if you have any sort of displacement on a terrain. So right now we're just going to take a look at how it is useful for terrains. And I'm going to go ahead and add in the landscape object, or add in a landscape object. And now if we were to use this to create any sort of clones using MoGraph and the cloner object, it's going to conform to the geometry we see right now. So if we had a subpixel displacement on the material of the terrain, any large changes are not going to move the clones. Also, just getting a little bit better of a look of what the terrain is going to look like if you have a displacement on it, it comes in the Displace Deformer. So we're going to add a Displace Deformer and add that to the landscape object group. And it works in two different modes. If we select the deformer, we take a look, there's a emulation mode. Now this is if you have material assigned to the landscape already set up with displacement. Otherwise, if that is turned off, you can set up either a custom shader, which you can add in any of the channels and use any sort of effects to create your displacement, or selecting a specific channel of any of the textures. Now, I've already loaded in a material, a dirt material, which is displaced. So go ahead and I'm just going to set up a slightly larger output for my render, and go ahead and add a little bit anti-aliasing so I can render this out. Now this is showing very dark, so I'm going to go ahead and increase the diffusion setting, which is a little too dark at the moment. So let's go ahead and lighten that up. So in this case, with this material, it'd be very difficult to control any sort of vegetation or objects we want to place on this terrain in order to get them to stay on top of the terrain. We have a very rocky terrain compared to the way it looks, just the object itself without the displacement. So what we can do is go to that Displace Deformer, and since I have that dirt material assigned, we can go to Object and turn on the emulation. Since I already have the displacement set up, we can use the emulation mode just to grab automatically from any displacement that is applied. Typically that would be the topmost displacement, so whichever tag is on the right. So if you have other landscape tags, it is going to grab from the displacement of the last or topmost material. If we turn off the displacement channel, it will turn off the displacement of the Displace Deformer. So now we have this being displaced, we don't need to subdivide as much, because I will need to also increase the resolution of the landscape. Right now it's only set to 100 by 100, so I am going to increase that to around 256 for the X and the Y, and we can start to see the landscape a lot closer to what it's going to look like at the time of render. So what we can do is increase the resolution of the landscape and then decrease the subdivision level within the polygon displacement. Also keeping in mind that we are displacing something that's already displaced, so you may need to modify the intensity settings since we already have the displacement itself being pretty much effective. But let's go ahead and take a look at a render of that, and you can see the difference. Now I do have what's going to end up being a slightly lower displacement in the overall quality because it didn't quite match up perfectly. And that's because my subdivision level went from 5 down to 2, so I would really need to increase the resolution of the terrain. So if I go ahead and increase the resolution or increase the sub-polygon displacement, they'll basically end up looking the same. But this way we can have the geometry as not only a preview, but also to effectively control the cloner object. Because otherwise it would be extremely difficult. So this is also a great way just to work on terrains, being able to already see the amount of detail and add something a little bit further beyond the rough and fine furrows, which basically control the overall look of the landscape object. The other way we can set up the displace deformer, if we don't want to use the emulation mode, is to go over to the shading and select, in this case we still want to use the displacement, so I'm going to select displacement and then drag that texture into the texture tag. So then we now have an independent setting for the height of the displacement and also our settings for how we're going to be displacing the terrain, which means we can run a separate displacement on the sub-polygon displacement than what we have set for the direct displacement. We also have some additional options because we can control the overall direction. So there's 3 different major modes, vertex, normal, spherical, and planar. And then with the planar, we get the option to choose a specific axis we'd like to use to displace. So really, depending on the effect you're looking for, spherical is really nice because you get some overlaps, and you can create some really neat-looking terrains. When using this separated mode, based on the shading and a separate height value, you do have to be a little more careful when you're controlling the clones because, well, you're going to still have that extra displacement from the material channel. So if needed, you can sort of reduce the intensity of the material displacement separate from the displaced deformer by setting up different height options and also just using different materials. So you don't necessarily have to use the material or the displacement that's part of the material mapped to the object. You could create a new material for that. That would be underneath the current material that wouldn't show, or it can be on any other object, or you could just set up that custom shading option. So under shader of the displaced deformer, setting that to custom shader. Unfortunately, custom material channels are not available within this. So it does have to be the primary channels that you would get within a material, and you do not have the ability to select the material. So if you have a, let's go ahead and add a custom channel, that new custom channel would not be something available within the displaced deformer. Custom shader is just custom. So custom output is not available like we have in the material where we could add pretty much anything. So that is one of the limitations. It could, of course, be possible to set that up within the Espresso editor. But as far as a direct setup, that is not available. So now we have something a lot closer to the actual geometry. And if you're going to start using very high geometry amounts, the maximum is 1000 by 1000 before you need to start using hypernerbs. Using a hypernerb object in order to divide it further. Although with the sub-polygon displacement, it ends up being a lot more of an efficient solution. What we can do is set up a display tag and adjust the level of detail. So I can bring the level of detail down to 25, and then what we can do is take the landscape object and increase that to a maximum amount, being 1000 by 1000, not showing up in the editor, so not affecting the system resources and then slowing down the scene by having especially several different terrains. But then the final output will affect and show all of that geometry. Now, the overlapping you're seeing, now by having this much geometry and this kind of displacement, you're going to see tearing and overlapping, and that's because I have it set to intensity centered. The centered mode is going to both displace outward from the object and inward as well, which is why we're having these little tears. So if the displaced deformer itself is okay at the intensity centered, then we would adjust the sub-polygon displacement of the material and adjust that to possibly intensity. Also keeping in mind that the subdivision level with set to 2 by having the landscape set to 1000 by 1000 is going to take a lot longer to calculate. And really depending on the complexity of the material, if you have overlays, it could take even longer. So sometimes you can get away with just having that landscape geometry set as high as it'll go, and then just subdividing once. So let's go ahead and take a look and see which material function in the displacement is causing the overlap. And then I can just go ahead and remove that. So that looks pretty good. We do have overlaps, which are creating more rock-looking geometry. But as long as they're not inverting and tearing, which is really primarily part of the displacement noise I was using, or am using, within the material, that type of noise tends to give that creased tearing look, but that direction now, with just having it set to intensity, those are going inward, so then we have the geometry overlapping, creating these kind of stone looking objects. So overall it looks pretty good. And I just want to show really quickly what I mean by the way the clones are going to be offset. And we can do this pretty simply with just using a very simple object. So let's just use a sphere. I'm going to go ahead and scale that down. We don't want it quite so large. Add in the cloner object, set this to object mode, choose our landscape as the object, render instances, and make sure that our mode is set to surface. And now we can go ahead and take that sphere and add it into the cloner object. And we should be able to start seeing those showing up. So with the displaced deformer off, the alignment of these clones is going to be based on that original geometry. And we'll go ahead and change the transformation of these spheres to make them a little smaller. And then also increase the count to about 2000. So we still have the sub-polygon displacement turned on. Although the intensity is not nearly as high, we'll go ahead and take a look at how that's going to affect our clones that are attached to this landscape. And I did modify the material to make up for the displacement of the displaced deformer, so I will need to reset that or bring that back to 5, intensity centered, and then we should see a little bit better of a representation. Also, I'm going to go ahead and bring this back down 256 by 256, and subdivision level of 2 for the polygon displacement. Go ahead and take a look at that. So with the sphere, our axis point, or the connection, is the center of the sphere. And what you can see is a lot of those spheres above the landscape. And the intersections is just not being placed directly on the object. So with this much of a transformation on geometry, in this case we would have, if you were to replace this with plants, everything would be above the terrain. And a lot of them up towards the back, where we can see they're going through everything, a lot of those would be underneath the terrain. So we really wouldn't have an equal value or what we wanted. So by using the Displace Deformer, we can get that geometry in there right away. So turning that back on, and we're getting a refresh. Going back to the material, reducing that again, back to where we had it before. And although in the editor it may not show up because we have the level of detail turned down, go ahead and turn that back up, which will also affect the clones that we're seeing. So if the editor is becoming an important part of the clone generation and you're noticing major differences, you might need to turn off any sort of level of detail adjustments. But as you can see, even though there are some modifications because I don't have the Displace Deformer extruding out as much as the material was, it does look a lot better and a lot closer to where I originally had the clones. So let's go ahead and take that Displace Deformer, set that to vertex normal. And now with that refresh, we can see that these spheres with the new geometry are matched up correctly. And overall, everything is just looking a lot better. So it's a much more efficient way to work with terrains. I also want to note, if you're using any sort of global noise and you have the Displace Deformer set to the emulation mode, it will actually, it shouldn't really matter if it's in the emulation mode or not. You can move the terrain through the noise. So it looks like this material is probably not set up for that. Yeah, we're within texture space, so I'll go ahead and set that to world space. And now we should be able to move the terrain through the noise. And it's probably going to be kind of difficult for you to see it within the recording. If you take a look at the cloned objects, they should shift around and move a bit. But really that's because the intensity isn't set very high. Because back in the emulation mode is using the intensity of the material, which is reduced to 2 at the moment. So we'll go ahead and bring that up to 15, make it really high, and now we should see that displacement moving through the terrain. So it'll even move the clones with it, kind of jumbling them around. Can create some pretty neat effects. Maybe not for natural scenery, but you could do some erosion effects that way by kind of moving through noises slightly. There's just kind of neat things you can do. But yeah, setting that to the world mode, you can move the objects and actually see where the displacement noise is showing up. It just adds that extra bit of detail to everything. There's one last option that's really important within the Displace Deformer. And if you go and select the Displace Deformer under the attributes and go to the Refresh tab, there's 2 different options, the Object and Camera. If we turn off the object mode, it's going to disable the refresh, or the automatic refresh, and make the terrain more of a stable state, where it's not constantly refreshing as you're moving around the terrain or making changes. So if you do modify the terrain displacement, you may need to turn it on and turn it back off in order to refresh it. But keeping these options off once the displacement is set will really improve the scene's load on the system, so you can make edits and transformations moving around the scene much quicker. Now, if you're using a world mode for the terrain, it should still update, depending on, of course, the size of the terrain. In this case, I did change it up to 500. So if we go ahead and lower it to 56, and now move the terrain, even though the refresh mode is turned off, we can still see the changes through the noise. Also, a quick note about the cloner on the displaced terrain. If the clones have not updated in the view after you make changes to the displacement, a quick way to refresh without turning the cloner on and off or setting seed values is just change the display option between wireframe mode, go to skeleton and switch it back, and that typically does refresh the clones.